All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are getting ready to make ratatouille. So as we talked about in class, talking about vegetable cookery, you guys are going to gain experience cooking with a lot of different kinds of vegetables. We have our eggplant over here that you guys are going to get to work with. We have our yellow summer squash. This is one of my favorite things to eat, especially in the summertime. I love growing summer squash, the yellow squash, in my garden. Zucchini. This zucchini is actually kind of small, but this is one of my other favorite things to grow in our garden. We're going to be using Roma tomatoes. We're going to be using red and yellow bell peppers. And if you don't have red or yellow bell peppers, that's perfectly fine. You're more than welcome to use green pepper for this. Red peppers and yellow bell peppers are a little bit sweeter than green peppers. That's why they're recommended. And we're also going to use onion. We're also going to, I'm going to be using some fresh basil. Okay. And some fresh parsley, it looks like. And I think this is the curly Italian kind. I have to double check. My husband bought it for me. This looks like curly Italian parsley, but I'm going to be using some fresh parsley for this dish as well. Unfortunately, we were out of fresh thyme at the grocery store, so I'm going to be using dry thyme. Those of you that picked up ingredients at the high school, you're going to be using dried basil and dried parsley. The biggest difference between the dried herbs versus the fresh herbs is that the dry herbs are going to have a little bit more flavor than the fresh herbs. When you're using fresh herbs, you typically have to use more fresh herbs than you would dried. So actually your dish might have a little bit of stronger basil and thyme flavor because you're using the dried instead of the fresh version. So as we mentioned, for our recipe here, our ratatouille, we've got our eggplant, our tomatoes, our squash, and our zucchini. Our sauce, we're going to use olive oil, onions, bell peppers, a can of crushed tomatoes, which I have hidden back here, and some salt and pepper to taste. So I'm going to go ahead and start out by preheating my oven to 375 degrees, and then I'm going to slice my eggplants, tomatoes, squash, and zucchini into approximately 1/16 of an inch rounds, okay? And then I'm going to set those off to the side. Once I have those prepped, I'm then going to start on my sauce. For my sauce, I'm going to heat the olive oil in a 12-inch oven-safe pan or over medium-high heat, and saute my onions, garlic, and bell peppers until they're nice and soft for about 10 minutes. So what I'm going to end up using is, rather than using just a normal skillet, I'm actually going to use my lovely little cast iron over here. Okay? As I mentioned in class, I'm a big fan of using my cast iron pan. When I make ratatouille, I especially like making this in the summertime with the garden fresh vegetables. And I like to use my cast iron because my cast iron is very versatile. I don't know how many of you are familiar with working with cast iron, but cast iron can be used on stovetops, it can be used on campfires, it can be used on grills, it can go on your oven. Cast iron is wonderful. So I like using cast iron because I will make my ratatouille, get it all set up here, and then I'll finish it off on the grill while my husband and I are cooking out. Okay? But today I'm going to go ahead, and we haven't got our grill cleaned off just yet. I think my husband went and bought tools for that today to get that started so we can start grilling here in the next week or two. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use my cast iron to make my ratatouille, and then I'm going to finish it off in the oven. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead, my oven, need to preheat to 375. Awesome. And I'm going to get started cutting my vegetables, okay? At this point in time, you guys are in culinary, so I'm not going to go through too much of a refresher on on your knife skills. We talked about that already when we made our balsamic roasted vegetables. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to cut everything up, and then I'm going to try to speed things up rather than talking through it. That way you guys can kind of see, that way this video will be a little bit shorter. For those of you that are curious, I know I'm wearing black today, but you can kind of see my little belly bump a little bit. Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, okay. 31 weeks along, and the baby is the size of a head of romaine lettuce. Okay. So I have my zucchini, my yellow squash, and my eggplant all cut up. My eggplant is definitely significantly larger than my zucchini. So when I put these together later, there's a good chance I'll probably slice some of this eggplant in half. That way I don't have huge chunks of eggplant compared to my zucchini. And I'll show you guys how I do that here in just a little bit, okay? But I'm going to continue slicing up my tomatoes, okay? To dice my red and yellow bell pepper, I'm going to cut them into julienne strips, and then I'm going to finish dicing them. As a reminder for my onion, I'm going to cut horizontal lines, vertical lines, and then cut across to dice my onion. Okay? Making sure not to cut all the way through to the stem, not all the way to the root end, okay? Are you just hanging out? Okay. So I have my eggplant, my tomatoes, my squash, and my zucchini all ready to go. I've got my ingredients for my sauce ready. I've got my oven preheated. So to make my sauce, I'm gonna go ahead and heat about a tablespoon of olive oil in my cast iron skillet, and then saute my onions, garlic, and bell peppers until they're nice and soft for about 10 minutes. I'm then going to season them with salt and pepper and add my crushed tomatoes, so my can of crushed tomatoes, and stir all my ingredients together along with some freshly chopped basil until they're fully incorporated. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to get my cast iron started to heat up with a little bit of olive oil. Once that gets nice and hot, I will start sauteing my onions and bell peppers, and then once I have my cutting board cleared off for my onions and bell peppers, I will chop up some basil and get my herb seasoning started. For my herb seasoning, I'm going to have some more basil, half a teaspoon of minced garlic, about a tablespoon of chopped fresh parsley, a teaspoon of fresh thyme, and a little more olive oil. Okay, so like I said, once I get my cast iron heated up, I'm going to make my sauce. I'm going to arrange my vegetables on top of that, and then go ahead and get my herb seasoning started. I am using fresh basil instead of dried basil. For the basil, you could technically take all of the basil and throw it into a sauce if you wanted to. Typically though, when you're gonna leave basil in something, you just wanna use the leaves, okay? I love fresh basil. I typically grow some of this in my garden too in the summer. So for the fresh basil, it's very delicate and very particular, okay? It will wilt very quickly, and you can tell that it's kind of started to go bad when it has some of those brown spots on it. Okay. But I am a big fan of fresh basil and tomatoes and fresh mozzarella cheese. That all sounds pretty great right now. That's one of my summer go-tos. But I am gonna go ahead and I'm gonna chiffonade some basil, okay? Chiffonade, if you remember back to maybe Foods 2, is where you cut your basil, your fresh herbs, into like strips like ribbons. And so to do that, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stack my basil leaves together and tightly roll them, okay? And then cut little strips. And this will kind of have a nice, it'll look a little bit nicer and prettier in your dish than just chopping it up. See these pretty little ribbons? Yeah. These will be really nice, especially in your herb seasoning that we're gonna be making here in just a second. Okay, so my bell peppers, my onions, and my garlic are getting nice and tender. You can kind of see my onions are getting a little more translucent, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna add my crushed tomatoes to this. And this recipe calls for 1 whole can of crushed tomatoes. Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and add some of my basil right now. So it kind of starts cooking down with it. And I'll add a little bit more here in a little bit too. See, isn't that basil so pretty with the strips like that? Like I said, you can use dried basil if you want, but I prefer the fresh. If you do use fresh, you'll probably just have to use a little bit more than your dried, and that's okay. As I mentioned, if you want to make Babish's version of Ratatouille that's similar to the actual Disney movie Ratatouille, you are more than welcome to do so. One of the biggest differences is the sauce that he makes I believe he purees. So rather than having these chunks of bell peppers in it, like I do, he puts it in a blender. If you wanted to, you could take the sauce, and once you finish cooking, you could put this in a blender as well to make it a nice smooth sauce instead of a chunky sauce. I think I'm gonna leave mine kind of chunky this time though, because I like the bites of bell pepper in mine. I'm gonna go ahead and my herb seasoning, I've got my basil in here and my garlic so far. I need to add thyme, salt and pepper, olive oil, and my freshly chopped parsley. So I'm gonna go ahead, add a little salt and pepper. My parsley, I'm just gonna do a rough chop. My parsley, same thing, I can use the entire stem if I want to, but I typically like to use just the leaves. And I'm just gonna do a rough chop. Nothing too fancy, okay? Just so I have smaller bite-sized pieces. So I don't have two big chunks of parsley. That looks good to me. And this recipe doesn't call for it, but I know Babish's recipe uses rosemary, and I typically like to use rosemary, so I'm gonna go ahead and put some rosemary in mine as well. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut the heat on this. Typically, I'd maybe cook it for a little bit longer, and I might also add a little bit of sugar to this to kind of balance out the acidity of the tomatoes, but this recipe doesn't call for it, so I'm gonna go ahead and leave it as is. The next thing I'm gonna do is we're gonna keep cooking this, okay? So I have kind of spread the sauce out the best that I can. And if you're putting your ratatouille in a separate baking dish, now would be the time that you'd pour the sauce into that baking dish and layer your veggies on top. But because I'm using this cast iron, I'm gonna go ahead and just layer my veggies in this cast iron. And what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna add a little bit of my basil here. And I'm gonna very carefully alternate all my vegetables. So I have this really pretty, all these really pretty bright colors. I'll see if I can get this a little bit closer so you guys can watch me alternate the vegetables. Okay, just like this. And like I said, some of my eggplant was very, very large compared to the rest of my veggies. So I went ahead and cut it in half. Okay? And that's perfectly acceptable. You watching me? Okay, so I finished layering all of my vegetables in here, and I actually have a couple extras. If you can see, I'll probably save these for later and use them in an omelet or just as kind of like a side dish for something else that I make this week. And at this point in time, I've salt and peppered everything to taste, and I have my lovely little herb mix here that I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna put right on top. I've got that thyme, the rosemary, the basil, the parsley, a little bit of olive oil, and some salt and pepper in here. And I think if I wanted to, I can use my spoon to kind of sprinkle it on top, but I think in order to get everything where I want it, I'm gonna just use my hands. Okay? Then the last step for this recipe is that I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna put some tin foil on this and pop this in the oven. If I was grilling out, like I said, I would probably put some of this, I put some tin foil on it and put it on the grill outside, but since I am cooking inside today, I'm gonna go ahead And I'm gonna put some tin foil on this, put it in the oven for about 40 minutes, and then uncover it and let it finish baking for about 10 minutes, okay? All right, 40 minutes in the oven, then I'll take the tin foil off, bake it for another 20 minutes, and I'll pull it out and show you guys what it looks like, okay? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, at this point in time, ooh, my goodness, I baked my ratatouille for about 40 minutes with this tin foil on, and then I went ahead and took the tin foil off and baked it for another 20 minutes. And I am gonna go ahead and pull this out of the oven. Ooh, this looks awesome. Okay. And there you have it. This is our traditional ratatouille. Okay. If you want to, like I said, you could serve it just like this. Just as is. This can be eaten as a main dish, or it can be eaten as a side dish. Like I said, I like to serve this as a side dish in the summertime. If you want, you can plate this in many different ways. You can put this on a plate, you can put this in a bowl, you could put some of these vegetables down and then put a lovely little roasted chicken breast on top. If you had a circular cookie cutter or a circular mold, you could plate this very similar to how Remy plates it in Ratatouille. But there you have it. I hope you guys enjoy this dish as much as I do. It's super flavorful, super colorful, and like I said, it's a really great summertime dish especially.